Welcome back to the Jeremy Ryan Slate Show. I am your host, Jeremy Ryan Slate, the CEO and co-founder of Command Your Brand. We help our clients to combat cancel culture by placing them on the right podcasts and new media. You can check us out over at commandyourbrand.com. Or also, I recently purchased thepodcastelection.com after the past election we have. So you can also go there and get to commandyourbrand.com as well. Reminder to like this video, leave us a comment, and smash the subscribe button if you support liberty, freedom, and want to build a better future. Guys, I'm very excited about the conversation we have coming to you today. Not too long ago, I was on Normal World on the Blaze, and today's guest was actually the co-host that day. He was filling in for Dave Landau, and we got a chance to hang out, and I was like, man, I got to have a conversation with these guys. So Jimmy McCartney, welcome to the show, man.
Thank you so much for having me, Jeremy. I'm super pumped to be here, buddy.
Yeah. So I guess in addition to looking like the second coming, why don't you tell people a little bit about your background? Because I think people know you really as a comedian, but in actuality, what we're going to talk about today is a lot of what you actually have accreditation in. So tell us a little bit about that, man, and what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name's Jimmy McCartney, and I'm a stand-up comedian, and I perform all over the country. But prior to being a full-time comedian, I actually was educated and went to school for social studies, and I have a master's degree in social studies education with a bachelor's in history. And when I was in school, I specialized in Canadian studies with a minor in Canadian studies. And so the main thing that I really focused on when I was in school was the history and development of New France as a colony. And so it's a part of history that kind of gets overlooked, and a lot of people don't know much about it, but it's incredibly significant for so many different reasons. And also, I believe it's important for people to know about it because it'll give people a different perspective on colonization and how not all colonies were run the same way.
Mm-hmm. I guess just out of curiosity, like, why do you think it's overlooked too? Because I'm a very informed guy. I've read a lot of stuff. I taught AP US history when I was a teacher for a couple of years. I was totally unaware of this. I guess, why do you think it just doesn't get any play, man?
I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, I would think more than anything, just because the population of New France was so low, maybe it was just deemed to be less significant. But it honestly, the population size of New France was one of the key components as to why it is so important historically. So to answer your question, I really don't know why it gets overlooked. It's honestly a disservice because it's incredibly important. We also, like a lot of kids, and I'm sure you know, like we learn a lot about Spanish colonies, not just British ones, but how the Spanish ran their colonies and their empire. Even a little bit with the Dutch, but not so much with the French in their North American assets. And it's a really, really big disservice to history because New France was run so much more differently than not only the Spanish Empire, but also the 13 colonies of the United States.
So let's talk a little bit about New France. Cartier starts his exploration in 1535. So let's, I guess, without getting too weighed down by the dates and stuff like that, let's talk a little bit about, what is New France? How does it come about? And what was so different about it compared to like how things operated here in America?
Yeah. So the short of it, New France is effectively what you would think of modern day Quebec in Canada. Primarily along the St. Lawrence River Valley, and the two cities that everyone knows about are Quebec City and Montreal. And like you mentioned, Jeremy, the first main explorer that's kind of credited with the foundations of New France is Jacques Cartier. Came over in 1535. Didn't really do too much, just kind of pretty much put the stake in the ground, said this is ours. A few other settlers came and went over the next few years. The big thing that really happened that was a major turning point is when Samuel de Champlain came over in 1608. And that's when things really started to pick up and change. Samuel de Champlain is a very fascinating person in history because he led the expedition for the French. But what's noteworthy about him, he was not going over with a mindset of conquest. He was actually raised with his father and his uncle, I believe it was the secondary source, that were navigators. So his mindset was primarily about exploration, seeing new things, charting things, not conquering and enslaving. So he came over in 1608. And the term Quebec is a term that means like where the water narrows. So if you actually look at, and if you look at Quebec City, it's an unbelievably important and good place strategically because not only is it where the St. Lawrence River narrows, it's also on a very, very steep cliff face. So it's like ideal
and
for
it's
defense.
So close to the perfect skiing as well at Mont Tremblant. But anyway,
exactly. So it's just a very important place geographically. So anyway, Samuel de Champlain came in 1608, found that location, settled it. Now, this is one of the most important parts, I believe, in all of modern history. So when Samuel de Champlain first got over here, he made immediate good relations with the Native Americans that he first encountered, primarily the Algonquins, who were hunter-gatherers, but also the Hurons, who were similar to the Iroquois in their beliefs and the way that they operated. So he made good relationships with them when he first landed. And then what they wanted to do was sail down the St. Lawrence into what is now Lake Champlain, which was named after him. And basically, in order to solidify the relationship with those Native Americans, they sailed down together, where they encountered the Iroquois, who were a very powerful Native American group that were located in modern-day New York State. And they were longtime enemies of both the Algonquin and the Huron and other Native Americans. So basically, the Algonquins and the Hurons were like, hey, those guys over there are the bad guys. They're our enemies. And in order to solidify this dynamic, this relationship, Samuel de Champlain actually went into combat with the Algonquins and the Hurons. And the coolest part about this whole thing is that in the midst of that first battle where he fought alongside his Native American allies, he actually stood up wearing metal armor and a metal helmet with what is like a precursor to a musket. Picture like an old version of a shotgun. And the Iroquois had never heard a gun. Obviously, they'd never seen it. They'd never seen these massive ships. So they see this man standing up with metal, like modern day Iron Man, with this massive musket. And he releases this incredibly loud sound with like all this smoke. And I think it was 3 of their chiefs were, 2 of them died right away. And one of them was severely injured. And they had never seen that. So the Iroquois fled. They were like, what is that? And this permanently solidified the relationship with the Algonquins and the Hurons. And they're like, the French are our homies. These are our guys. Like, let's go. So the reason why that's so important is because even from the very beginning of New France, Samuel de Champlain created very, very close bonds with those Algonquins, Hurons, and the other Native Americans, and simultaneously immediately made enemies with the Iroquois. Who that's also not the native term for the Iroquois were the Haudenosaunee, which means the people of the Longhouse. So anyway, flash forward a little bit as the relationship starts to develop.
That's just like the Babylonians called Noah Upnapishtim, but that's neither here nor there. But anyway, continue.
Yeah, similar idea. And so the reason why the British established relationships with the Iroquois is because the idea of the enemy of my enemy, right? So the British have been going to war with France forever. And they start colonizing in New York and, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and they encounter the Iroquois and they're like, hey, we hate the French. And then the British are like, we do too. So the alliances that eventually culminated in the French and Indian War were set at the very, very beginning. Now, the reason why New France developed so differently than other colonies was the way it was set up. They had a very, very low population as opposed to the British 13 colonies. At the time of the French and Indian War, which takes place a very long time later, there was only 100,000 people or less that were living there, as opposed to over 1 million that were living in the 13 colonies. So they had a very low population, but also the incentives for what they were going for in the colony was so vitally important. And it was primarily focused around the fur trade. At the time, the fur trade was like it. It was like the equivalency of getting the newest iPhone, getting a Tesla. Your fur hat that you wore in Europe was a status symbol of how wealthy you were, how modern, how popular, everything. The fur hat was like it. And so the fur trade was unbelievably massive. But in order to have furs, it's not like mining gold. You need to have land. It needs to come primarily from beavers that are out in the wild. So how do you get those? The Native Americans who know the land. So the French, for an economic reason, developed incredibly good relationships with the natives, not just like around Quebec and Montreal, but in the surrounding areas, which is how New France was able to control such a massive area with a very, very low population, because they had direct economic ties to the different Native American groups. And the guys that used to go out into the woods were called the coureurs du bois, like the runners of the woods. And they had such good relationships, with exceptions, obviously. I'm not trying to claim everything was perfect, hunky-dory, but overall, they had extremely good relationships with the Native Americans, and they would trade things like axes and metal products for these furs. And so the French were able to develop trade networks that were unbelievably massive. From modern-day Ohio down the Mississippi River all the way up to Quebec, northern Quebec, it was unbelievably massive. And they did it with a very, very small force, because they had good economic relationships. And the most interesting thing about the coureurs du bois, the fur traders, is a lot of them actually married Native American women, and this led to the creation of the Métis people, who are, I think Métis translates to like mixed race. So effectively, it was just a blending of the culture of the coureurs du bois and the local natives. And they're still alive today, and primarily in Manitoba and in Canada and Ontario as well. And so the dynamic that New France created, primarily driven by the fur trade, which did not require massive amounts of land. It required good people to navigate, to track down furs in trading, led to stronger and social relationships with the Native Americans that were very different than other colonies.
So here's the thing that's really interesting. It's interesting. It's interesting that it's France again, and I'm going to take a little bit of a detour and bring us right back. This is quick, but are you familiar with what the Albigensian Crusade is? Have you heard that term before?
No, I haven't.
Okay, so from the years 1209 to 1229, there's this part of southern France, we know it is today, like Provence and areas like that, where they had like kind of gotten to this point where men and women were equal. They had like voting rights and stuff. And this is in the 1200s. They had gotten to this place. And what it did is it ended up freaking out the Pope. So that it was one of the only crusades other than the one on Constantinople where the Christians actually turned on their own people. And there was like millions of people killed in this part of France. So it's just very interesting that the French seem to keep doing these things right. And then they could keep getting broken down throughout history. Once again, I have no French in me, but I just find that interesting. So I guess looking at that then, how does this thing break down or kind of where does this thing go? Because it sounds like, obviously it's not perfect, but it sounds like there's some like, some mercantile agreements and stuff here, and they're looking at it more of business and expanding land and stuff. So how does this whole thing change?
So, I mean, this pretty much continued up until the 1750s, where there was, like I said, right before the start of the French and Indian War, there was about 100,000 people that lived in New France. That was it. It was very, very small with a massive area. Primarily, the fur trade was like the main thing, and then this supporting economy, so like hotels, restaurants, that kind of a thing. A little bit of farming, which do you know the Montreal Canadiens in the NHL?
Yeah, absolutely.
Referred to as the Habs. So that stands for the Habitants, which were like the farmers that lined the St. Lawrence River. So these are like
I've heard that phrase. I had no idea that's where it came from.
Yeah. Yeah. And the thing that's really interesting is that those farms are very, very uniquely shaped. When we think of farms, we primarily think of like a grid. Because the St. Lawrence River was like the primary source of everything, what they did was they gave each habitant family very narrow strips of land that each touched the St. Lawrence and went back a very long ways. So when you look at those farms, there's lots of very, very thin rectangles that line the St. Lawrence River. And so anyway, that was pretty much how things went. A little bit of farming, a little bit of a commerce and support economy, but primarily driven through the fur trade. And there were mishaps, there were missteps. Nothing was perfect, but overall, the relationship that the French had with the Native Americans was really, really solid. Eventually, in the 1750s, when things started to break down even worse with the British, you saw things kind of spiral out of control. And George Washington, actually, when he was fighting for the British, was leading some of the initial skirmishes that took place between the French and the British over control over, like, I think it was near modern day Pittsburgh. And so the 7 Years' War breaks out, which a lot of people consider to be the First World War, because wars were breaking out in Europe and the colonies overseas were starting to fight. And so effectively, the two lines that were drawn were the British with the Iroquois, who that line was drawn with Samuel de Champlain in 1608, over 150 years before, which is pretty fascinating. And the French with their multiple different Native American allies. And so the war broke out, and it was a really, really, really interesting war because it was two completely different systems and two completely different ways of navigating things. Eventually, what ended up happening was the British with their navy were able to blockade Quebec. And then eventually, General Wolfe for the British was able to draw out General Montcalm for the French on the Plains of Abraham, which are like a flat plain near Quebec City. And they had a battle which the French lost, and they lost Quebec City. And then not far long after that, New France fell. But what's really interesting is with 100,000 residents and a relatively very small army, France was able to control an unbelievably massive amount of land. And it was primarily because of the relationships that they had with the Native Americans and the commerce that flew with it. And a lot of people talk about like the merits of capitalism, about why it's so good. And I don't know have you ever heard the phrase of like forced altruism through trade?
What the idea of your enemy is not going to I guess it's what Thomas Friedman in modern times calls the golden arches theory of economics, where if any two countries have a McDonald's, they're too economically tied, so they're not going to fight each other. Is that what you're talking about?
More or less. The idea of when you're trading with people, you're not going to go to war with them.
Right.
And so I think the primary thing to think about with this, when we think of New France, it's like, again, I want to reiterate, not everything was perfect. However, it was drastically better and a lot more peaceful than other colonies because it was derived through trade, through the fur trade. And so they had a very, very different relationship, and it led to so many different things. And there's actually further implications from it. And one of them is one that everyone knows. We all hear about the Cajuns. Everyone knows about the Cajuns. We all hear about them. They're a massive population down in Louisiana. They actually came from the area of North America called Acadia. Now, Acadia is where modern day Nova Scotia is. And the Acadians were French settlers that were very peaceful. And I believe the natives that were there were the Micmac. And they had good relationships with the Micmac. These are basically just peaceful farmers. In one of the wars before the French and Indian War, the British actually gained control over this. And they told the settlers that were there, they're like, listen, you can stay here, you can live, but we need you to sign an oath of allegiance that you'll never take arms against the British. And they asked the Acadians multiple times to do this, and they just refused. They said, we're not doing that. They didn't really do anything drastic, but they didn't sign the oath of allegiance. And eventually, during the French and Indian War, the British decided to deport them. And so there was about 10,000 of these Acadians, and the vast majority of them were taken at gunpoint and spread out everywhere. They weren't genocided. The British basically said, we're going to break them into tiny little pockets throughout all of our empire around the world, and then they'll integrate, and then they'll disappear on their own.
Sure.
What ended up happening was one contingent of them, a large contingent of them, ended up in Louisiana, and
which is a French territory at this point until the Jefferson administration. So that makes sense.
Okay, and so what ended up happening was the Acadians were doing correspondence with the different tiny little pockets in the Carolinas and in Britain, in France. Some of the Acadians actually ended up all the way in the Falkland Islands off of Argentina. And they basically sent correspondence and they said, this is our largest group, come here. And so a lot of them relocated to Louisiana, and the Acadians, the slang term to Cajun. And that's how we have the modern day Cajuns today. And there's over 800,000 of them today.
Wow.
And so, yep. And so that's a history that a lot of people don't know. But the most important aspect of all of this is that the French and Indian War, which the British won, they defeated New France and Quebec, it fell. And now the British gained control over this, but the war was incredibly costly. So the most interesting and important aspect of all of this history is that as a direct result of the French and Indian War and the British claiming control over New France, the British Parliament decided to levy taxes on their subjects. And they said, well, we primarily defended the 13 colonies and they benefited the most from this. They should be paying. So we're going to implement taxes. And this is where the taxes started coming from that directly led to no taxation without representation.
Wow. Okay. So there's that's, I didn't consider that. That's wild. So if this doesn't happen, we may not, like maybe we would have gotten there eventually, but we may not have had the American Revolution. So that's an interesting part of it. But I guess one thing in the notes you sent me, you mentioned as well that there was some sort of, what did it say here? Some sort of a betrayal or something like that. What was that, and what part did that play in this situation?
Some sort of could you give me a little more context?
Hey, I'm trying to find the notes I had written here, so just bear with me here. Here, what did you say here? I have a lot of information here, which is great. Just bear with me here.
Take your time.
Oh, it says downfall, Quebec captured with deception, New France falls. What was the deception element?
So effectively, like I said, Quebec was incredibly amazing defensive position because it's where the water narrowed and it was at a very steep cliff face. And so effectively what General Wolfe was able to do in the nighttime was he had his men climb up the cliff face, and he made the British or the French believe their position was getting so entrenched that General Montcalm, if he would have done what he should have and stayed and waited, their backs were against the water, he could have probably obliterated them. But General Wolfe was able to make the Montcalm think that their position was gaining more and more strength. So instead of staying behind the walls of Quebec City, which are still there today, they're massive, they're so well built, and they had tons of cannon. Montcalm believed that the only solution that they had, because the British were more and more of them were forming ranks, that they had to go out and fight them. And instead of staying behind their walls and defend themselves, they went out onto the plains of Abraham, and it drew out the French army. And even though the British army was much smaller, the French army wasn't as well equipped for like standard European line fighting as opposed to like hit and run tactics that they learned alongside the Native Americans. So the British were able to beat their ranks and cause them to break. And then eventually they had to abandon Quebec City. So because of General Wolfe doing something that was honestly very crass and very bold by climbing up the walls at night and forming a line, he brought the French out to combat instead of staying behind the walls to defend themselves. And then eventually Quebec City fell. And when that happened, Montreal was next. And then after that, New France fell completely.
And now, a word from our sponsors.
The Wellness Company and their doctors are medical professionals you can trust. And their new medical emergency kits are the gold standard when it comes to keeping you safe and healthy. This medical emergency kit contains an assortment of life-saving medications, including ivermectin, Z-Pak. Rest assured, knowing that you have emergency antibiotics, antivirals, and antiparasitics on hand to help you and your family stay safe from whatever life throws at you next.
So you can support the Wellness Company by heading over to twc.health/JRS. That is twc.health/JRS. Get up to 15% off select products. Support the Wellness Company and help support this show. Thanks again. So, Jimmy, there's a couple hypotheticals I want to look at here because I feel like there's so many angles you could take on this. But I guess the first one is, if you look at the French Revolution, isn't a crazy amount of time after this, right? Like timing wise, we're less than 100 years to people's heads getting chopped off in France. And I guess, do you think this played a part in this? Because this is a massive territorial change, and it's going to, not too long after this, they're going to start selling these colonies to the Americans. Do you think that this played a part in the French Revolution?
I mean, I would say directly, absolutely. Because, I mean, if you think about the context, that immediately after this is what led to the American Revolution. And then after that, I do know for sure that during the French Revolution, a lot of people were claiming, like, if the Americans are doing this, why not us? Mm-hmm. And also the economic hardships that come from that. So I'm not an expert on that completely, but I do know that these things are not independent. They're very, very linear, and they're all directly connected. So I'm sure that in some ways the sentiment of, what was lost, now the economy isn't doing as well. The Americans have freedom that we don't have. Maybe we should have that too. So So let's say the French and Indian War doesn't happen, right? What's the fallout from that? Like, I guess, how do you think North America forms differently if that conflict doesn't happen? Well,
I know there's a lot to consider in that one.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, everything would have been different because the French, even though they had very small populations, they had forts that were lining all across North America, claiming their territory. So the French would have claimed a massive territory that would have led eventually. I mean, the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, was inevitable. It was going to happen at some point between the British interests and the French. Because the British were imposing further and further westward, which is what kind of sparked it to begin with. So I feel like it would have been inevitable. I can't really see a way that it wouldn't have happened. But one of the things that's interesting to consider is just the fact that, like, the way that the war took place was so different than most. And also, like, the implications that they had, the ripple effects of them were so profound. And one of the things that a lot of people know, like, people know of Quebec, right? As a province, but the people there are French speakers. And as opposed to, and this is one thing that I didn't talk about before, but this is something that's really important because it does relate. It's not speculative. It relates directly to today. So Canada has over 30 million people in it. Montreal is one of the largest French-speaking cities in the whole world. These are the direct descendants of the Quebecois that were there during the French and Indian War. Most of those people did not relocate. They stayed. Now, the British had a problem on their hands because after they defeated the French and New France falls, they have all these people. I think at the time there was like 60,000 or so citizens, non-military combatants that were living in Quebec. This was way bigger than the Acadians. They didn't have the resources to ship them out like they did with the Acadians. So the British basically said, listen, here's the deal. You are going to be British subjects now. All we ask of you is that you basically just say that you're British subjects. And the British did something that was very lenient, which wasn't typically common in history. They said you were allowed to keep your language, you can continue to speak French, and you can keep your Catholicism as opposed to being Protestant. So the British were actually pretty lenient to the citizenry of Quebec. And the reason why that's interesting is because those people, through generations, obviously their population kept increasing, their culture, their way of life kept developing. And this led to, in 1995, I believe it was, a referendum where the Quebecois, the modern day Quebec, who are the descendants of those settlers hundreds of years ago, they literally had a referendum to try to separate from Canada because they remember that they were once a French or a New France. They were not British controlled, and they have never really viewed themselves that way. Still today in Canada, there's a lot of tension, not to a point of violence, but just like a lot of cultural division between the Quebecois and the English speakers. So much so that the license plate of Quebec says "Je me souviens," which means "I remember." It's literally a statement of remembering that they were not originally a British territory. And so there's been multiple times in history where the Quebecois have tried to start movements to separate from Canada as a result of this. So the ripple effects of what happened with New France are still affecting us today, not just with the creation of the United States and all of the things that led from that, but also the Quebecois themselves that live there. And here's where it gets even wilder. Not all of the Acadians were deported. There were some that managed to stay away from the deportation process. And there's still quite a few of them that live in Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, a little bit in Nova Scotia. And if you see anyone with a license plate on the front that looks like the flag of France with a gold star in the top corner, that's the flag of Acadia. And so those people still exist today. And so the ripple effects of New France are still affecting us in massive, massive ways.
Are there any other like ripple effects or modern occurrences you see because of this? Like things like maybe we're not considering or cultural things or whatever there might be?
Absolutely. So there's a thing in Quebec called the language police. And effectively, Quebec still has...
Wow. Like
so
what kind of language police?
That's not their only role. It's not like they're police officers that go around with guns and they just say, speak French. Like it's not quite like that. But the French do.
I don't know. When I've been to Paris, they kind of look down on you if you don't speak French, but you know.
That's like a very, very French thing of feeling that way. But basically, in Quebec, there are many language laws where if you are doing commerce, you are required by law. Like, let's just say you're allowed to start a business if you're an English speaking person. You can do that. But let's say that you are an English business and you're sending an email to another English business, and you know both of you are primarily Anglophones, people who speak English first. You are still required by law to send that email with French in it.
Wow.
Signs have to be written in French first. There are many, many laws that the Quebecois have instilled in Quebec to make sure that, because they're afraid. They know that the United States has over 300 million people. English-speaking Canada is like 23 million. They see that English is all around them, and they're afraid that if they allow English to be spoken too much, that eventually it'll get washed out and then they'll dissipate as a culture. And so still today, there are many laws. And like I said, it's not like the police go around with guns, but you do get fines and stuff if you don't adhere to this. And it's still an important part of Quebec today.
Wow, this is very interesting to consider, because I feel like at any one of these large events, there's so many permutations that could happen. I guess from that perspective, do you think the American colonies always would have broken off in the way they broke off, or what? How do you think this would have affected, I guess, things outside of Quebec, like looking at things like here in America?
That one's hard to say. I mean, because we all know that the whole taxation without representation thing was the spark. That was it. Not to say that something wouldn't have eventually led to it. I'm sure that eventually maybe cultural differences could have done it, but that was the primary spark, and those taxes were levied as a direct result of that war.
Do you think that if the British, because I think the thing that's interesting too is I look at I look at other occurrences of this in the world, and like one that came to mind for me is like the Punic Wars between the Carthaginians and the Romans. And the Carthaginians are actually interestingly enough, the Romans are the conquering state, which is very similar to the British, and the Carthaginians were more of like this mercantile state where they even had like a board that made all of their decisions, it's really, really interesting. If you understand, like for them, like economics was like their major thing, and this didn't match what the Romans believed. So I guess like looking at it, do you think that if the British approached economics in a different way, this could have affected how the American colonies formed?
It could have. But this is the thing that I think that's important to consider. When I said multiple times that France had much better relationships with their Native Americans that were in the area that they controlled as opposed to the British, I don't necessarily think that it was because the French were somehow morally superior or...
No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying like their viewpoint on how they operated.
Oh, no, for sure. That's what I'm getting to.
Okay.
I think that the reason things happened the way they did was purely based on the situation. So Quebec is much further north, so the growing season is shorter. It's not as fertile for farming. The resources that the French were there for was, like I said, there were other things like lumber and fishing and stuff like that, but it was primarily the fur trade. I think that is the key. I honestly think the key to all of it is not cultural differences between the French and the British, but rather the incentive as to why they were there. So to answer your question, it depends. I mean, what are the things we think about most with the 13 colonies? Farming, tobacco, cotton. I think the British system would have probably been pretty similar to what it was, regardless of other factors or if they had a different perception. I think what would have changed it is what are the things that they were looking for when they were there? Like what are the resources that they were there for? I think that would have been the key into determining whether or not the British navigated their colonization differently than they did.
Very cool. Jimmy, this has been really interesting, man. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and it lived up to what I was hoping for, too.
Awesome.
Because when I get a subject I know nothing about, I am thrilled. And not to say I know everything about everything, but I'm aware of a lot of things. So for people watching this, how can they connect with you? How can they learn more about you? And we're definitely going to have you on the show, again in the future. But where can people find you, man?
Yeah, so on Instagram and TikTok, it's the exact same thing. It's 6 letters. It's GYM, like a gymnasium, YIV, like India Violet, GYMYIV. And I have over 250,000 followers on TikTok and over 700 on Instagram. But when I say that 700, that's not 700,000. It's only 700 followers on Instagram. So if you guys want to follow me on Instagram, that would be awesome. Like I said, I am a comedian. Like Jeremy mentioned, I'm a comedian. So you're going to find comedy content on there. But I do try to do things that are not just hacky, low-hanging fruit stuff. I try to do stuff that hopefully a lot of my comedy is supposed to be like relevant to cultural issues and things like that.
It's funny because you and I were talking a little bit before we got going here as well. And I always tell people, my degree's in the Roman Empire, because I don't want to sound like too highfalutin. But what my master's degree is actually in is the apotheosis of Roman emperors. That's the becoming of a god of Roman emperors. And I feel like for us history people, man, like nobody really cares about history until the shit hits the fan. And then they want to talk to us about history. So like for the last 15 years, I've done nothing with my degree. And all of a sudden they're like, this feels like Rome. And we're talking about it. And I feel like it's similar to a lot of these concepts. So us history people have had to kind of do like other things to figure out how to make money. But I'm glad to see that, we're getting to have more of these conversations. And I definitely appreciate you coming on here to have it, man.
And I really thank you for having me, because I honestly believe, and I'm not connected to it. I'm not French really hardly at all. It's like less than 5% of me is French. So it's not like I'm over here rooting for France and thinking that they're amazingly altruistic. I think, though, that understanding the history of New France is incredibly important for people to know, so that they don't just get this view of history of Europeans just going over, enslaving, killing everybody. All the other dynamics and cultures were like oppressed and everything was terrible. They were very different between different colonies. And history is a lot more complex than just what you see on like a Jeopardy answer or a Google search. And I think New France... Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
All I was going to say is I think that New France is a very strong testament to how things are much more different and much more complicated than what most people know or want to think about. It's not as easy as yes or no, or as simple as black and white.
Well, it's interesting, too, because I think, once again, as being somebody, as I mentioned, I taught AP US history. This is like 10 plus years, more than 15 years ago when I did that. And even in the lessons you're supposed to teach, it's kind of like, the French were up there, they did some fur trapping and blah, blah, blah. But let's talk about Henry Hudson and let's keep going south. So like we just don't even discuss it. And I think that's the same thing I've seen with these conversations with Rome is like, it's not that we're saying it's different. It's not that we're saying it didn't happen. It's just not covered. And I think when something isn't covered, you can't learn from it. And that's why these conversations are so vital.
Exactly. And to bring it full circle, the reason why I was talking about why I believe capitalism is such a good economic system is because the development of New France is completely testament to that. They didn't even speak each other's language. They literally couldn't even speak hello. But through commerce, they were able to develop massive trade relationships that lasted for over 100 years. So I believe personally, as I support capitalism, New France is testament as to why, trade amongst nations is prosperous and good for everyone.
Wow. Cool. Well, once again, to those of you out there listening, reminder to like this video, leave us a comment, and smash the subscribe button if you support liberty, freedom, and you want to build a better future. We will have Jimmy back here in the future. So thank you, everyone, for listening.